Hello, and welcome to Chapel FM Arts Centre. If you're in the room here with us, and East Leeds Community Radio, if you are listening. This is the 5th day of Writing on Air, it's the 7th Writing on Air Festival, 76 programmes in all, and it's been, so far, a fantastic range of programmes too, all on the theme of missing. But tonight is a really special event, and I'm so pleased to be here in this room, and I'm sure you will be by the end of it as well. So without any more from me, Hibiscus Rising.
I am Tony Macaluso, Director at Chapel FM Arts Centre. I'm here with Max Farah. Hello, Max. How are you?
Hi, I'm Max Farah from DOMA, David Oluwale Memorial Association.
So, Max, this event it's the culmination of a very, very significant past week or so. Can you tell, first of all, what's happened over the past week?
So the really happy thing this week is that we've launched Hibiscus Rising, which the people in the auditorium can see some photos of on the wall right now. It's a very beautiful sculpture, which I'm going to say a few words about in a minute, but it's the culmination of a very long process in which we've spent a lot of time trying to talk to the people of Leeds about the David Oluwale story, which I'll also outline in a second or two. And
Max, just to give a bit of context, a lot of people's lives have converged around David Oluwale's story and legacy. In your own case, what was your involvement? How did you first get involved?
So I had the good fortune to pitch up in Chapeltown in 1970, and I was a student here in Leeds in the 68 to 71 period. I was away 71. When I came back in 1972, one of the first things I noticed on the wall outside the Hayfield, some of our listeners might actually remember the Hayfield Hotel on Chapeltown Road, right by the Hayfield Hotel on that beautiful Yorkshire stone wall that they had there, the words "Remember Oluwale" had been painted in huge white letters. And that really struck me. I didn't know what it meant at the time. I'd missed I will say something in a minute about the trial of 2 officers in 1971 for what we believe was the murder of David Oluwale, but I'd missed that press publicity, and the only reason why I got to know about it properly is that a very important black journalist called Ron Phillips wrote a long article about the trial and about David's life in a magazine called Race Today, which I read in 1972. So it's been in my heart really since 1971-72, this story.
Well, we've got a fantastic and really significant panel of people, experts, historians, cultural figures, leaders in the community, poets coming up in just a bit. But first, just for people, especially out there listening on the radio, who maybe aren't familiar with David Oluwale's story and its impact on Leeds, do you mind just give a quick version for somebody who's completely new to this?
Some people know that I don't do quick versions, but I really have tried to get myself in order for tonight to do this. The story is not a happy story from 1953 onwards. David arrives from Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria, in 1949. He comes to Leeds very shortly afterwards, and for 4 years he works extremely hard doing the unpleasant jobs that even then in the post-war, the rebuilding of Leeds in post-war Britain, even then white people were reluctant to do. So he was a hod carrier on a building site. He shifted carcasses around in the abattoir at Leeds Market. He did all kinds of pretty hard jobs, but at least he earned a living. And he was able to have quite a nice time with his other West African friends. There weren't many of them, around 50 at the time. So he would go to the pub, he'd go dancing at the Mecca, and the kind of this is what we know to be a pretty good, well, a reasonably good time for him, given that he was doing rotten work and he was subjected to racism in Leeds at that time. But we seem to think that he was pretty okay at that point, and his friends called him Yankee because he loved American music. But between 1953 and his death in 1969, he went through really grim times. He was incarcerated in what was then called Menston Asylum. Then he was let out in 61. He became he was very, very poorly when he came out of Menston. He was more or less homeless or living in poor lodgings from time to time. And then he went back into what was by then called Hyroid Psychiatric Hospital for a couple of years. The last 2 years of his life, he was systematically hounded by 2 police officers, Sergeant Kitching and Inspector Elliker, and we believe they caused him to die by drowning in the River Aire in 1969. The trial that I referred to a minute ago took place in 1971, and the officers were not convicted of his murder or even his manslaughter, but they were sent to jail for a criminal assault upon him. And as I say, the story pretty well, it was very well covered in the news at that time, but shortly afterwards, people forgot about him altogether until 2 books came out in 2007 that brought the story back to life. The happy side of it, and I really want to emphasize that there are some positive outcomes of this, and Hibiscus Rising, which is still up there with the fabulous artist Yinka Shonibari and members of our board, and Kulitiara from Leeds 2023. This really is a triumph of Leeds deciding that it is going to turn this macabre story into something really positive. And I want to just read you what Yinka said on Radio 4 earlier this week, so that you understand how Yinka has framed this beautiful 10-meter-high flower that now adorns the Meadow Lane area of the city centre of Leeds, just near the point at which he was drowned, in fact. So this is what Yinka says. I wish, if you can find this on BBC Sounds, front row, Wednesday, and Yinka's voice is a good deal more interesting than mine, I can tell you. So, but I will read what he says, because this is the context in which we want to frame the ongoing discussion tonight. This is directly quoting from Yinka. I think the story is so tragic that I wanted him to be remembered by something nice. He was a very lively man. He loved American music. His friends called him Yankee. And I wanted to do something uplifting. And I thought about the hibiscus flower, because I grew up in Nigeria, and David also grew up in Nigeria. In brackets, we think he was about 19 when he arrived in Leeds. Yinka goes on, when I was in Nigeria, I saw the hibiscus flower everywhere, and I used to suck nectar out of the flower. It reminds me of very nice times when I was young, and I wanted David's legacy to be nice things. The hibiscus symbolizes love, empathy, beauty, and passion, and I wanted his legacy to be those. I also wanted something that would bring the community of Leeds together. And I think those of you who visited this, and those of you who can look at, if you go to your online sources and put in Hibiscus Rising, David Oluwale, you'll find all the photos that we've been posting recently of the flower. But ideally, you'll come down into the Meadow Lane area, just south of the river, just near Leeds Bridge, crossing the David Oluwale Bridge, and you'll see what a joyful and beautiful thing this is. My last words on this short introduction are to say that we want this to stand for the best part of Leeds, and the best part of Leeds is the social justice part of Leeds. We want it to stand for the eradication of the afflictions that David endured: racism, mental ill health, homelessness, police malpractice. We've got to stop this in Leeds, and the Doma charity is all about educating and campaigning for a much better life, a more inclusive, a more friendly, a more welcoming life for all.
Thank you, Max. So in just a moment, we're going to start to hear from our panel, but first we have bit of poetry, and then a few sounds from the unveiling this past weekend. So I'd like to invite Cherie.
So we're bringing Cherie Taylor-Baptiste to the audience. Cherie has produced a poem ages ago for us, which is in an anthology we published in 2016. And she's a Leeds lass with a very passionate commitment to all the issues that we're talking about tonight. Over to you, Cherie. Read this lovely poem.
Thank you, Max. This is my poem about David Oluwale's story, and it's called He Remains. David's last run weighed on all our thighs, carrying the black man's burden and tripping on Darwinian ties, fascist fists downward spiraling his own mind's twists, then filthy push into the river air. Dirty shame, mucky waste, Nostrup's sewage works his final place. no milk and honey there. From the foundry where he worked, right out to Middleton Woods, where, like a stray dog, they often left him, you'd think someone would have heard his hounded tears. And in Bridal House doorway, where one of them relieved themselves on the bed he slept in, that the mannequins would stand head bowed for years. But in the Market Tavern, they didn't pause, pint down, lips not yet wet. And at Mulgarth Police Station, some say to its very last day, they'd still not truly heard David yet. But Leeds Golden Owls saw Sergeant Kitching and Inspector Elliker and witnessed the city's shame. They'd watched Enoch's rivers of blood slipstream in and heard the promises drain and seen that, like trade winds, the mental health policies shift and rough sleeper services drift, but none erode the stain. Stow away regret, but neither river nor owls forget, and so he remains. Because as he was gathered up by water, he was wishing for wells in our eyes now, hoping we could see for him his Lagos skies now and know him, not as Aliwala or Wog, but that Oluwale, or God Comes Home, is his name, and write it with the George Floyds, Trayvon Martins, Sarah Reeds, the Bicos, in the scorebook of injustice end games, because we're still in same mire, simmering with David's fire. But Yorkshire winds gently cultivate space for him and fan his flames, and with those sparks, hope flies. And even in the mist of our sighs, he is breathing. He remains.
And now, before Max introduces the panel, we have just a few sounds, a minute and a half or so, just some of the sounds of the unveiling that happened just this past Sunday along the river. So here's that.
Coming out of the sad story of David Oluwale and the likes of him in the past, this sculpture represents hope and optimism for the future.
It's a real splash and call of colour, and it's stunning. So I think when you walk from different angles, you can see the top reaching out to the sun. You can see it from David Oluwale Bridge, and it really does grab the attention. It really has a message, I think, of life.
What David Oluwale's story reminds us is there's still millions of people exactly like David who don't have anywhere to go, don't have people.
I think from the day I entered Leeds, I knew of the David Oluwale story, but he certainly got a direct link to Yorubas in this city. Yes. And the David Oluwale Memorial Association have been brilliant in keeping his memory alive.
Look at this sort of hopeful, joyful, flourishing flower, and that this came out of a dreadful, dreadful story. And I was thinking, I hope it's all right to say this on the radio, but like when you plant something in shit and it flourishes, and this is what we've got here. So this makes me hopeful, and this is so much what we need at the moment.
Looking at the different colours, reflecting the different cultures, different people within the Leeds community, and also making Leeds a more compassionate city, not leaving anyone behind. It lifts your spirit. That's what this does.
Thanks so much to Chapel FM for doing those Vox Pops. I want to just take this moment to say how grateful we are at the Oluwale charity for the support tonight of Chapel FM. It is an extraordinarily important project that they've got here in Seacroft, and it's a delight to be talking to a Seacroft East Leeds audience and our friends in California and Switzerland and Italy and Germany who are tuning in. Thank you for coming on air with us tonight. The Vox Pop really did capture the joy that we had as we unveiled this. It was unbelievable when the sun came out on Friday and Saturday and showed it in its absolute splendor. And it is, as Shonibari hopes, it is a symbol of beauty and passion and empathy and love. We have, as Tony said, we've got a very good panel here, and we were going to include Michelle Sau, and she's sorry that she couldn't make it, as it turns out. The reason for asking Michelle Sau to come tonight was that her dad, Abi Sau, was a friend of David's from 1949 onwards. And Abi Sau came from the Gambia. He was a young man, also about 18 or 19. But Abi's career was a wonderful, inspiring contrast, really, to David's, and it's the kind of career that David could have had he not fallen foul of the police and the mental health system. But Abi got a job quite early on in a ceramics factory and worked in that ceramics factory so well and was so approved of by his boss. And so, as when I spoke to Abi's wife, Michelle's mum, she said that the boss loved Abi and nurtured Abi, and then gave Abi, when he died, gave Abi the whole business. So Abi, for many years, was the proprietor of a very successful ceramics business where it's located is sort of around the university area, just north of the Merion Centre. It's all been redeveloped, that area now. But Abi had this good life, and he was the person who really tried his hardest to support David in his most difficult times. There's a very good book that, if you wanted to follow this up, by Kester Aspden, called The Hounding of David Oluwale. And Kester has used a whole bunch of records acquired during the putting together of the trial proceedings. And our friend Joe Williams is just going to read something from Kester's book, which describes Abi's efforts to help David.
Nobody had more contact with Oluwale in 1967-8 than Abi Sau. He knew him from those carefree nights at the Mecca. Since then, much had changed. Sau had moved to the suburbs. He had children. He was building up his wholesale crockery business, Northern Pottery. They met again sometime after Oluwale's release from Hyroids. Sau's warehouse was near to the squat, and Oluwale, more or less, landed on his doorstep, looking thin and weak. This is how Sau remembered their meeting. I noticed that Olu was in a very bad way. He was shabbily dressed in a very old raincoat and a flat cap, and was carrying an old duffel bag with all sorts of things in it. I invited him to my premises for a warm because he looked terrible. I could see that Olu had fallen on hard times, but I didn't want to embarrass him, so I did not remark about it to him. I asked him where he was living, and I think he told me he was living up Woodhouse Lane somewhere, but due to his appearance, I formed the impression he was sleeping rough. At this time, Olu only talked small talk, mainly about my business, and did not talk about himself. Olu was a very proud person and would not ask for help. I took pity on him, and he realized this. I gave him some clothes and some money. I could see by talking to Olu that he was a completely different man. He was not the man I used to know. He didn't talk sense, and I thought he was a bit simple in the head. After I had given him the money and clothes, he left.
Thanks, Joe. We'll come back in the discussion a bit later on to what Abby also has to say about David's experience, particularly of the police. But right now we're going to go into a slightly more structured bit of the evening's program, and I want to bring Joe Williams back on to say something about his memory, his direct memory of David when Joe was a little boy. You can tell that Joe's still very, very young, but he did know David in the 1960s, and Joe is a very significant figure in the cultural life of Leeds. He's the founder of the Heritage Corner program, which is a perpetual reintroduction to people of the true history of Africans in England as a whole, but particularly in Leeds and the African diaspora. So Joe's a really marvelous person to hear his own memories of as a little lad with his mum in Leeds seeing David. So Joe's coming back to the microphone to just to relay that memory.
Yes, I mean, you couldn't miss David in those times. I lived in the just behind Park Lane College, around Swarthmore area, Swarthmore Centre there, and St. George's Crypt was near there. So we had to cross the bridge, and St. George's Crypt was on the other side, and it was unusual to see a black vagrant in those days, and I must have been about 6 or 7. And I just recalled that memory of perhaps I was staring and my mother squeezing my hand and yanking me away. Perhaps I was staring, I don't have any memory of that. But I do have memories of seeing this man that I couldn't identify as David Oluwale necessarily, but it was a homeless black vagrant.
Can you remember how you felt at those moments, Joe, when your mum was sort of hurrying you by?
Well, yes. I mean, I was scared. He did look, disheveled, and I think to a young boy, scary, and like a bogeyman, in a way. I haven't shared this with you, Max, but I recalled from the same house on Claremont Avenue, my siblings getting very excited for us siblings to come out the house and see a naked black man running through the streets from the town end toward Burley. So, and we were told that it was somebody who escaped from a mental hospital.
But it wasn't David. You don't know.
No, I don't know. But I can say that there was definitely other. If it wasn't David, then it points to other black people in institutions at that time.
Yeah, one of the things we might discuss in the second half is the massive over-representation of black people in the mental health system as a whole. Yeah. It's as bad today as it was then. So it's quite possible that it could have been David, but it's equally possible that it could have been other people who'd fallen foul of the psychiatric services. Yes.
But I definitely picked up on my mum's attitude, whether I was staring or not. She would squeeze my hand and kind of drag me away as if... Yeah.
It brings to mind a story that we haven't got the person here this evening, but the daughter of a very important Irish lady who was massively supportive during the effort to bring this story to justice, really, Maureen Baker. Maureen would take David into her house. Maureen and Paul Baker would take David into her house in their house in the Hyde Park area and give him a bath and give him a meal and so on. And their daughter said to me that she too felt very uncomfortable in the morning when she'd come down and find David there, because he was an unusual figure. And as Abby Sow describes, you know, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for adults to be in the company of people who are really, really down on their luck and behaving strangely. But thanks for that, Joe. And as I say, we'll come back to you in a bit. The other person who I want to ask for a personal memory is my friend Carol Eden, who's here, who actually works in the NHS, and if she could stay for the rest of the time, she'd talk a lot about the NHS, but she can't stay for the second half, so I'm going to ask her something about the NHS now. But the first thing I'm going to ask her is just to tell the listening audience and the people in the room here why the David Oluwale story has meant so much to her, because of her memory of being a little girl and hearing the story from her grandma. So could you just describe that, Carol, for us?
Yes, so yeah, I've always had David on my mind for, ever since then, really, because I was brought up by my grandma, who's an Irish lady, and I can remember being in tears. She was crying and really upset, and she was alternating between crying and getting really angry about this, what she was reading in the newspaper, and I just couldn't really work out what was going on at first. But
how old would you be roughly at that time,
I was born
Carol?
1959,
so the trial is 1971. She's probably reading the stories to you.
Yeah, she was reading.
You're about 11, probably.
Yeah. And she didn't ever pull her punches about anything in front of anybody who was younger. She would just be reading things, and I can remember her actually wanting to go down, saying that she wanted to give these policemen what for. She was so angry, and in those days we didn't use paper tissues, it was hankies, and she kept having to get a new hanky. She was so upset, she was crying that much. So I actually thought that David was a relative of ours, because my grandmother was from a very, very large family. So it could have, you know, we could have had relatives all over, we had relatives in Ireland and things. So I thought David was a relative of ours, because she was so upset, and she was saying prayers for him, and yeah, she was just so upset about it. And it's always been in my mind.
Yeah, and it's lived with you ever since. And it shaped your thinking about social justice and your thinking about injustice and the eradication of injustice. Do you think there's a special affinity? Because we find a lot of Irish people have been very supportive of the Oluwale campaign. Do you think there's an affinity between the Irish experience in Leeds and the experience of these African diaspora?
Definitely, yeah. I went recently to Irish in Britain exhibition over in Holbeck, it was, and there was a picture of the signs that used to be up. There was no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. So, and you know, I know my grandfather couldn't go in certain pubs because he was so, you know. So there was definitely that affinity. But my grandma was a real humanitarian. She was always on the side of right. And she was always very cross about any wrongdoing. She would have, if she saw someone bullying somebody in the street, she would be out there. In fact, one time she was washing up and in the kitchen, and she sort of flew out of the door, and there was a chap with a horse and cart, and he was hitting his horse because it was a little bit of a hill where we lived. And my grandma actually took the thing off him and hit him. So she was always on the right of...
She was on the side of horses on this occasion.
Yeah, so if she'd have got hold of those policemen, you know, she was going down to those courts, if she'd have got hold, I wouldn't have liked to have seen them.
Yeah, your grandma sounds like one of us. Yes, yeah. So since you can't stay for the second half, Carol, it's really kind of you to be here, given that you've got a family event tonight, and there might be some David Oluwales there if you're lucky, but not David Oluwale's as such, but other people from other parts of the world. But the experience that you've had as an NHS worker with a mental health remit, what would you say is the issue nowadays for people from, well, say, of African descent, or even people from South Asia or East Asia as well?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, things have improved over the years, but, you know, back when I first worked, I was, you know, on a ward in a big old hospital. I do remember people just not having any cultural awareness at all. I really think that I've been very lucky, because I have always mixed with people of a different culture. I had a friend starting school who was from Pakistan, and then I had black friends. So I find that that's really enriched my life. But there are some people that I get shocked at that they don't know, you know. And
even people in the NHS in a caring profession.
Yeah. I've seen people. I have actually witnessed. You know, someone was going to get a meal. I was helping him. I was only young. He was like what you call a cadet nurse in those days. And he was a Sikh chap and very, very unwell, very depressed. And he'd gone up to get a meal, and they'd put this plate, and he sort of pushed it back like he didn't want it. He wasn't saying anything. But then they pushed it back at him, and he said he didn't eat it. And they said, "Oh, you lot don't eat pork." And I was so cross. I was only young, and I said, "He's a Sikh," and this, you know. And it was.
But they had no idea what the cultural differences were about
and
diet.
Over the years, I've tried to sort of, and it's got better. People, you know, there's training, different cultures and things. But over the years, I've always tried to really stand up for that, really, to get people's cultural awarenesses, and you know, if we were doing cooking, to try and do different foods and things like that, and you know, but yeah, it's getting better, but it's a long way to go.
It's not good enough. Thanks very much for that, Carol. That's really helpful. Now, I'm going to turn to another star member of our panel, and this is Arthur France, who is well known in Leeds because, amongst many other things, he is the founder of the Leeds West Indian Carnival in 1967. But Arthur has a long career which is just as significant for the benefit of the city as the cultural work he's done, and that's a long career in what back in the day would have been called Black Power, or the autonomous organisation of black people based in Chapeltown, but speaking to black people across the whole of Leeds. Nowadays, I guess, would be called anti-racism or something like that. But Arthur has various distinctive memories to do specifically with David Oluwale. And I'm going to start by just reading something from... I had the good fortune to sit with Arthur during lockdown, under proper lockdown conditions. We did a lot of interviews, and we produced a book, which is Arthur's biography, Arthur's autobiography, rather. Actually, technically, it's a biography, but anyway. And I want to quote from this book, because this is something that was said to the House of Commons, who had a select committee on what they, in those days, rather quaintly called police-immigrant relations. And Arthur was a founding member of the United Caribbean Association, and the submission that they made to this inquiry does tell you something serious about what's wrong with the city of Leeds in the 1960s. So here's the testimony that's in the House of Commons report of 1971 to 72. This is what they said: harassment, intimidation, and wrongful arrest go on all the time in Chapeltown. Black teenagers returning from youth centres to their homes in groups are jostled by the police, and when the youths protest, police reinforcements with dogs are always ready just round corners. Police boot and fist youths into compelling them to give wrong statements, but the right one that the police requires. We believe that policemen have every black person under suspicion of some sort, and for that reason, every black immigrant here in Leeds mistrusts the police, because we think that their attitudes are to start trouble, not to prevent it. So here's a report from the Caribbean community, and of course, with that in mind, when Arthur and a Nigerian friend of Arthur's called James Aboba heard of the death of David Oluwale, and it began to become apparent that police were involved in this death, Arthur paid a lot of attention. He and James organized a picket outside the Crown Court, which in those days was in the Town Hall, in Leeds Town Hall. They had a picket to show the jury and the judge that the black community, and there were quite a lot of students came down from Leeds Uni, socialist and anarchist students came down to join that picket. People came up from Brixton in London to join that picket. So it was a way of saying to the establishment that they were under scrutiny. And I just want to ask Arthur to come to the mic and say what he remembers from sitting in the dock, listening to the evidence against the officers, the two officers, Elliker and Kitching, who were accused of his manslaughter and of grievous and actual bodily harm. Could you just come up to the mic, Arthur, and just say what you felt were the most salient things that you heard whilst you sat in the dock?
I find, for me, I must first say,
I said Arthur was definitely not in the dock. He was in the gallery, like the audience is here. That the police would probably have liked to have put him in the dock, but he was in the gallery.
I must first say, I'm an African born in the Caribbean. And whenever I see someone who looks like me in distress, it could be extremely painful. And knowing Oluwale, and I understood very early how racist the system was. And to see how Oluwale over a period of time getting down and down, and listening to the evidence.
Sorry, let me just interrupt 1 second, Arthur. That means that you remember seeing him on the streets. You would occasionally see him as living rough. Yeah.
And we sat there, and you make to believe that judges, people who carry out the law, are more humane, especially a judge, for they would have gone through lots of training. And the way he conducts the whole hearing in the courts. And when they had these two young policemen who seemed to use David as a toy, and at times David will be seen maybe sleeping in a doorway, and whenever he's being seen, you've got to phone Milgard, and these two police will go to pick him up, and the things that they will do to him. There was an elder policeman who used to be on driving duties, who used to drive the vans. At that time, the police used to have a Bedford van with the engine inside and a metal case over it. And the police information that he was given, and he went through it, and the way David was treated.
I think one of the officers testified to them using the engine cowling to bash his head on whilst he was inside the van.
They get a call this night, and David was in Park Square, and he was just stood there in the street crying. And so the news went down to Milgard after they went to pick up David. And when they get to him, one of the policemen hold him on a headlock and sling him in the van and get in behind him and beat him, hold him back in the headlock and beat in his head and the engine until he get to Milgard Police Station. And then when he get to Milgard Police Station, the heavy wood oak doors, and still with the headlock, and took his head and opened the door, bam. And when he threw him in and he threw him in the face down on the floor, he kicked him in his balls. And the police said, you could see the agony that you see a man lift him in the air and
with a kick.
With a kick and the agony. And the evidence and the way the judge, and I couldn't believe if this is a judge in England, you must credit the policemen because, I mean, this is England that I personally, was very lucky to be born in the Caribbean. When I read the history of England and the false picture they give us of a white man in England, this was completely different. And you could understand why people do certain things sometimes, because sometimes events make you behave in a way you don't normally behave. Because, as I said, the way I felt about the judge and the thing, it was...
Please tell me you acted with some restraint. Arthur could be very, very powerful in these situations.
Well, at that time, I was very extremely radical, because Max will tell you, I used to preach black power, and we used to go around the country, for we had a network of black people, Leeds, Birmingham, Manchester, Leicester, and London. So you understand that. And the thing is that we understood the law wasn't here to protect us, the law was here to destroy us. And we know our rights, and we know you're going to stand for any nonsense. So we used to go around, make these black communities around the country aware of this system you're dealing with.
Let me just ask you one other thing, because this is an important history which most people don't know about black community organizing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, well, right up to the present day, but particularly so in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But one of the outcomes of the Oluwale trial was a training program called the Leeds Scheme, which became called the Leeds Scheme. It was a training program to try and help police officers understand black communities, which I think Maureen Baker and other members of the United Caribbean Association set up. You remember that scheme, and you told me in the book, and I quote you in the book, of what you said when you sat down across the table after the Oluwale trial, what you said to the police officers there. They've got Oluwale, but... Would you like to just repeat what you... This is Arthur looking senior police officers and junior police officers in the eye across a so-called educational gathering, and he says, I hope he comes in on cue.
You're not going to get away with it. Because one of the things we knew, we had a very radical group in Leeds, and the police was more scared of us than anything else. Because one of the things they didn't understand, most of us in the Caribbean had a very high education system down there, and understand the system, and this is why we could have done the things that we have done. And the police knew they had to back off.
Can I just fill in the quote that I'm looking for, Arthur? Sorry. Arthur says, he looked them in the eye and he said, "You've killed one of us, but you're not going to kill anybody else." And you can imagine the impact that would have on your average police officer in this, because Elliker and Kitching probably are outliers. They had accomplices, but they are outliers to actually cause a man to drown. But Arthur says to them, you've killed one of us, you're not going to kill another.
Wow.
And that is part of the reason why Leeds has improved. It's taken a very long time, and there's been continuous training. And the hero that we haven't mentioned so far is actually a young police cadet, a 19-year-old cadet called Gary Galvin, who had his suspicions when he heard that David had been fished out of the River Aire down at Nostrop Mill. He had his suspicions that his seniors, an inspector and a sergeant, had caused his death. And Gary had the incredible chutzpah, really, to go to his sergeant and say, I want to explain why I think Elliker and Kitchen have done this. I think they have done it. And his sergeant said to him, if you want to take this any further, you must talk to your parents first. And for Carol will be pleased to hear that it turns out that Gary Galvin is also of Irish descent, and it might be that reason that his parents, good Irish Catholics, said you've got a suspicion, it probably is well-founded, you must take it forward. And that's why the trial took place, because Leeds police in their senior levels did realize that there was something deeply wrong in the Leeds police force, and an inquiry was called, and the evidence was gathered meticulously, and the investigating officer was convinced that Elliker and Kitching were murderers. They were never charged with murder, they were just charged with manslaughter, and they got off on that as well. But it is thanks to some police officers who did begin to shape up from the 70s onwards. It's taken a long, long time, and we'll come back later to how much better or not good enough that it is today. But is it your experience over the years, Arthur, that policing has become a little bit less racist than it was then?
Yes, they do. They do, but for me, I'm a very strong optimist. But I don't believe in my lifetime you will see the end of racist system. You know, we talk about the Americans. It's happened here. It's only a couple of weeks ago, police shot a black man. I mean, and the amount of... I was spotted in Leeds by a white woman, 1963. 1966, I was spotted. 1990, my wife was on her way to St. James's Hospital, and was spotted by 3 white blokes. Last year, October, my granddaughter is in a university down south, walking through London, and she was spotted again.
Spat at?
Yeah.
Spat at?
Spat on. Spat on. And these things, to me, is all right.
Disgraceful.
We don't want to say it. We don't want to think, but these are the facts.
Can I just stop you there, because we're running towards the end of this session and we've got a couple of other little gems of poems to come. But do you want to just take a seat, Arthur, and just see if anybody from the audience wants to chip in at this point? It's not an opportunity to make long speeches, but either questions or comments from the people here we'd be grateful to hear. Oh, this is the moment when you have these pauses. I used to work at Leeds back at university, and it was always like this. The students, all the bad students on the back row, they'd never say anything, but the good students are on the front row, so somebody's going to speak up. Oh, Tony's going to speak up.
I'll put a question out there, which I'm just curious. I'm relatively new to living in Leeds. I've been here for a few years now, so I'm just curious if, and maybe if Arthur, Joe, or Carol, if you have a sense of this, whether young people coming up, does this story get told at all in the schools in any way, shape, or form in the city, or do young people have a kind of way that they tend to find out about it, or is it mostly rely on them happening to connect with projects like this in order to learn this history? Or, Sherry? There you go.
I actually did some workshops just last year in association with Huddersfield Literature Festival. What we made, the actual poem that I read earlier was put to a film with music by Omar, Lifebook MBE. So we had the kind of film, but we also workshopped the ideas around it, looked at racism, and they wrote their own poetry, and it was so well received. And I think what was comforting was, even though it was, it wasn't the most diverse school, but there is far more awareness. And kind of, I remember one of the comments one of the girls said when we were discussing racism, she said, racism is something that you can't really understand unless you've actually experienced it yourself. And I think just that humility and awareness of it being something that you're allowed to say, I don't know, but I know it matters. And so hopefully, that's something that I'm wanting to kind of move forward with and do more of. But I think it's really important for the next generation.
Thank you.
Carol, did your children have much education about these sorts of issues? Do you remember when they were in schools?
Not in school, but I certainly have told them. But not really in school.
What about your grandchildren? Did they feel?
Yeah. My grandson was more aware, but certainly, I mean, my children a mixed race anyway. And I know when they were at school, there were some issues. I used to have some issues. I had to go into school about some issues. One issue was about the hair. There was some issues with my daughters had the hair plaited, and then we got a letter back saying that they weren't allowed dreadlocks. And then my son had a line put into his hair. So, and then there was, and the teacher rang me really getting cross, saying, we've got important visitors and your son's got an extreme haircut. And it was just a line, and it could look quite neat. But yeah, so I had a lot of, but now my grandson gone to the same school, no problems at all. So
there's signs of progress there.
Yeah.
And Arthur, you do get asked to do carnival workshops in schools, but do you get asked to come in, or do your family members get asked, or Joe, do you get asked sometimes to go into schools to talk about African history or you know, the Leeds history in this respect?
That's an odd question for me, because I started my career in the 1980s doing theatre and education, and we were doing a lot of anti-racist work. And it's a little bit disturbing for me to see that that work has gone backwards. There's backlash, and there needs to be more work. But I think teachers are under immense pressure, and used to have good conversations with teachers in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and then it changed.
Yeah, the charity, the Oluwale charity, is invited occasionally to go into schools, and if there are any school teachers listening, we're always available to come into schools. And working with Leeds 2023, who've been so supportive of the whole sculpture project, we've got a sort of side game with them, which is to develop educational materials for schools. So there will be some resources available soon for teachers who want to engage in this story. And it can be done as part of the, you know, it wants to be integrated into the curriculum.
I personally, I don't think they want to change. 45 years ago, after the Stephen Lawrence murder, they spent millions of pounds write the Swan Report. And every education authority in England had a copy, and it never come out the cupboard. 10 years after that, after the Stephen Lawrence death, murder, they rewrite it and call it the Macpherson Report. They still haven't done anything. And I feel personally very angry, because I'm an African, and people who look like me, I don't think they will ever accept us as a normal person, and that is me personally, because I dealt with it. I do a lot of work in schools. The Church of England, the Catholic Church, spent some millions of pounds, write a report, and it came out last year. There was a discussion on television where it's been written on the church, and it haven't been done. 2007, we're the only group in this country who did the transatlantic slave trade. People must understand who we are and where we came from. And we did a education pack, 350 pages education pack, with a tape as well. And every school in Leeds had a copy. Have they opened them? So we could talk till the cows come home. It ain't going to happen. I hope that I'm wrong. And I got very angry, because I saw our children and most of our young people, and they are lost souls. You only got to meet some of these young people, and they're completely lost. And you know, when you don't know who you are, you got a serious problem, and that is a problem.
We're just coming to the end. I can see Tony's watching the clock. We're going to ask Keith, who you...
we first have just a round of applause for
sorry.
Arthur, Joe, and Carol for joining us here.
You can tell I'm new to the broadcasting game. I should have said thank you very much to the illustrious panel, Joe in his 2 roles, and Carol and Arthur and Cherie for their contributions. Whenever we do anything with the David Oluwale Memorial Association, we always make sure the arts are represented. And we met Keith because he came to a poetry workshop that we did a few months ago. And in fact, it's Keith who's introduced us to Chapel FM. So we're very grateful to Keith. And he's written one poem specifically about David Oluwale, and then he's going to read another poem that's from somebody else after that. But you do yours first, Keith. And this is Keith Fenton, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello. Firstly, what a great panel, and I feel very humbled to be standing in front of people who actually had real life experience of David. I was only 8 months old when he died. It may make some of you feel old. And the other thing was a couple of things before I carry on. One is, Cherie, next time you read a poem, please make sure people aren't chopping onions nearby at the same time. So I haven't taken my coat off yet. I'm going to do it at half time. I feel like there's sort of unfinished business here. It was a very joyous occasion last week. It was very emotional. I felt like David finally got his send-off. But as some of the themes here have been about the structural, the systemic problems that killed him, this poem it riffs off the nursery rhyme, Who Killed Cock Robin? And through that, Bob Dylan, about 60 years ago, did a song that riffed off that called Who Killed Davy Moore, about a boxer who died after the fight. And so this is riffing on that, so you might recognise the rhythms of it. And the refrain, which is Who Killed Oluwale? Who killed Oluwale? Who are we, or they, to say? Not I, said P.C. Morris Roberts, who knocked our David to the cobbles at King Edward Hotel. His cudgel fell through dance sweat air. Without that blow to his addled brain, he might have sworn at me again. So yeah, it's true, I made him fall, but you can't blame me. That's all. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not I, said Dr. Michael Leahy, who took David's case in a room at Jimmy's. I wrote that he wept like a child. My job's not to assess his head, just his mind. I drove him beyond the borders of his land. But you can't blame me for trying to be kind. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not I, said the hyroid shrink in Menston's dank and pissy stink. This trumped-up, thumbs-down little Caesar with his high-voltage treatments, bringing on seizures in arenas of solid stone. When I have to treat someone, I'm just paid to make them calm. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not I, said charge nurse Eric Dent. I only gave false evidence under orders from the management. But we must subdue the manic grins of unpredictable savages. And anyway, don't some of us have families to feed? Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not us, said the warders at St. George's Crypt, whose explanation for non-admission inadvertently slipped into the public domain. And guess what? Yeah, it was the same old reason again. It was them coppers who harassed him. It wasn't us. who pushed him in? Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not I, said Geoffrey Elliker. I'm just an ordinary inspector. We moved him on to the Fox and Hounds to Middleton, and yeah, now and then we tickled him. But that's the job when you're on the beat, to drive these bastards from our streets. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not I, said Sergeant Ken Kitchen. It's true, I rolled him in a dustbin down the county arcade floor, and I pissed on him while Geoffrey held the torch. It may seem cruel, but sometimes you have to stir the pool so the scum don't settle. And then we are paid to make things better. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not I, said Mr. Justice Hinchcliffe, the distinguished judge, whose idea of justice done for a dead black man was 18 months, who gave these men the briefest penance, but first directed the jury that David was the public menace. I was just trying to show an even hand. This august land has rule of law, and it wasn't written by the poor. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not I, said the tabloid writer who took the trouble to describe the men who took David's life as merely clearing street detritus. It's only what they said in court. And anyway, folk just buy this for the sport. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Not us, said some few million readers in a body who soak up this poison copy, who from the edge of frilly seats chow down hard on red meat gristle, good dogs, ears cocked for that whistle. It wasn't us who made him drown. And didn't both coppers get sent down? And anyway, some of our friends are brown. Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Who killed Oluwale? Who are we or they to say? Who killed Oluwale? Who are we and who are they? Thank you.
So Keith's now going to another register, and this is a poem by one of the co-chairs of the David Oluwale Memorial Association, Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall, and she wrote a specific, she's a reader in post-colonial literature at Leeds Beckett University, and she's written a particular poem specially for the Hibiscus Rising opening last week, and this is a testimony to the importance of the sculpture that we opened these discussions with an hour or so ago. So, Keith, in your Emily Zobel Marshall voice, please read a shorter poem.
I'm glad you introduced I met Emily just over a year ago, and I've really got to know her a bit more in the last 5 or 6 months since that event at the Tetley. And I found her extremely supportive, and I've heard about the work she has done along with Max. And Chloe, in bringing about this amazing thing. And I'd like you all to know, Max and Chloe and Emily, if Emily watches this, and anyone else who was involved, that was a really emotional day last Saturday. And the when Akil, my friend here, and I arrived in glorious sunshine, we expected to see it resplendent at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was actually in shadow from a building. We saw Emily on the way, just where Oluwale likely fell into the water. I say fell. And we hugged and we went up to the Tetley, and we were a bit disappointed about the way the sun hadn't come down on this thing. And then the dancers you saw in the red stripy uniforms, they came out, Emily spoke, and as soon as their feet hit the ground dancing and their throats were full of song, the sun hit the top of that hibiscus, and while they performed, it started to come down. It was incredible. And then later on, after dark, Max took some pictures of this, and some of you were there. There was an impromptu, no, it wasn't impromptu, but it was an unofficial send-off, really. With Lara, was it? Lara Rose.
Artist, yeah.
And
Lara Rose.
She gave, and we poured libations, actually just a bottle of water, plastic bottle of water, including my daughter, who's 16. It was a very emotional moment to see David, after 54 years, nearly 55, finally get the send-off he deserved. And we have those people to thank for that. And I'll never forget that day in my life. And Emily was a big part of that, and she's been really encouraging to me. And this poem is a very beautiful poem. I'm probably not going to do it justice, I'm afraid, Emily, if you're seeing this. Emily's in New York at the moment. She's talking about racism in literature. It's what she's good at, and she also speaks a lot on the behalf of our city. And we always feel that she has our back. So, Emily, I salute you. And this is your beautiful poem, and I'm sorry I'm about to murder it. It's called Oluwale Rising. The river tried to carry me away, but you stem that pull today. See how this flower has grown, bursting out of concrete to remember me here and carry me home. You remembered me in strokes of pens and brushes, in lyrics of lament. Every thought you had for me, a petal scattered on dark waters. Every plea of peace for me, a blessing on the breeze. People of Leeds, in your dreams you seeded me and grew me a hibiscus, blossoming from pain, blossoming from stone, forever reaching for the sun, gifting me the knowing that you hear my breath in yours, and we can rise as one. Thank you.
So now we will have a 15-minute interval. There's soup, there's coffee, there's tea, there's cake downstairs. So enjoy some of that, and we'll be back up for the second half in about a quarter of an hour. See you soon.
Good evening. Again, welcome back to those of you who have come back. Very powerful first half. We had some great testimony from people who actually knew David Oluwale. And Cherie and I are going to introduce a couple of guests. And after we've done that, we're going to ask Akil to come down and read a couple of poems. One of them is about David Oluwale, and the other one is about Palestine, just to remind us that there's other places where people are struggling under systemic oppression. And but before we do that, we want to go, now I think we're partly obscuring him, but Chijioke, you're here, and I would like to ask you, you're here in what capacity? Yeah, I've got to give you the thing.
Then I was invited by Max. So it means the terms are friendship and goodwill. Yes. I work in Hare Hills as an organizer. A lot of my work cuts across police accountability and community cohesion. So I'm hoping just to speak a bit about that, and how that might be helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to pull this over here to find Arfan Anif. And you are the CEO of Touchstone. You want to tell us about that?
Yes, well, I work for Touchstone, which is a mental health charity and service provider, and we operate across West and South Yorkshire, working with various communities from the preventative side and working with people in hospitals.
I mean, maybe I'll start by just asking you, Arfan, in your experience, what are the structural problems within the mental health, arena regarding, particularly the representation of black people?
So people are clear, I'm not an expert in mental health. I don't have any qualifications in mental health. I'm not a professional. I don't have any qualifications in psychology, medicine, psychiatry, or anything like that. Even though I've been introduced as the chief executive of Touchstone, I started at Touchstone as a service user about 10 years ago. And I'm quite open about my lived experience. I don't consider mental health illness as an illness. The only illness is stigma, prejudice and discrimination, not mental health. About 11, 12 years ago, I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. I was taken away from my family by the police. And I was sectioned for about a month, not too far away from here, the Newsom Centre, which is a mental health hospital, which is about a couple of miles away from here. And when I got assessed, I was quite shocked. I felt, am I one of those statistics? And it was quite an experience because I was taken in by the police. That brought a bit of an added challenge and anxiety, considering a few days before I actually went to the hospital for support and I was ignored. Unfortunately, a significant proportion of people who are black, Asian, and other minority backgrounds do get sectioned, and usually it's enforced, and often they're brought in by the police. And whilst I was in hospital, the majority of people who were patients were people of colour. And people of colour are not the majority in society. Something didn't feel right, and at the time I raised the issue of race, and the so-called professionals, they said, you are presenting yourself in a way. You've got a mental health issue. I said, no, you've got racism in this place. It's so obvious. When I got discharged, I was then given what's called a community treatment order, which is another enforcement way of dealing with someone with a mental health condition. And I just want to take a step back to give you some actual statistics. If you are a black, African and Caribbean man, you're 4 times more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act enforced. And in terms of getting a community treatment order, you are 10 times more likely to receive a community treatment order. So what it is, the mental health system, instead of being a health system, is an instrument of the state which is being weaponised, against people who are underrepresented. That can be people who are working class, but also people from black minority ethnic backgrounds as well. And that was the key conclusion for me as I travelled through the pathways. And I realised that this mental health system was very westernised. No one really knows how the mind operates. Yet with their isms and schisms and have controlled to roost for 60, 70 years, we are still in a crisis. We have 8 million people in this country on some form of antidepressants. Part of the crisis is not resources, it's because those people in charge have got vested interest. They've not really solved the problems. So when I came to Touchstone as a service user. And Touchstone has been going for about 40 years. It's a community-based mental health provider, currently employs about 300 staff, but had very humble beginnings in South Leeds, where 2 social workers organised a support service which they felt was required, something that should be originated from the community, led by the community and delivered by the community. Fast forward, 40 years later, we employ nearly 300 staff. So when I arrived as a service user, as you do through the various pathways, I ended up what they called third sector provision, charities. And on my first day as I arrived, the 3 people I was introduced to were someone from an African Caribbean background, who just happens to be the uncle of Micah Richards, the football pundit, a Muslim man who wore a Swahili kameez, and a woman from a Chinese heritage. I felt at home. It didn't feel like a mental health system as such. And they had this perspective that you should lead the service that's provided to you. You may have heard the term trauma-informed. That I know best in terms of my mind, my body. And it was totally different, and I ended up getting a part-time job, and a few years later became the chief executive of that organisation. And my motivation is, through the lived experience that I've gone through, is to ensure others don't and advocate on their behalf. I challenge my NHS peers who hide behind their flashy titles, who hide behind isms and schisms, to really highlight how the system has been weaponised. And racism is endemic. It's thriving in the mental health system. It's the instrument of the state. In most mental health hospitals, there will be a police suite. The criminal justice system is entrenched within the mental health system. And many people are brought into the mental health system, especially if you are black, African, Caribbean man, via the criminal justice system, not the health system. Another factor is there's an underrepresentation in primary care. If you're black, pass go straight into hospital or prison. You do not get support in primary care, and part of that is underrepresentation. So some of you may have heard CBT therapy or cognitive behaviour therapy. That the practitioners tend to be white women. And I always get told there's a lack of recovery amongst black minority ethnic men. Well, what do you expect? The service doesn't represent those particular groups, so you can never have equity without representation. So, for me, like I've always said, mental health is not an illness. It's how society looks at mental health, the stigma, the prejudice and the discrimination. That is the real illness. So that's my interest in mental health. Like I said, I'm not an expert, but I do know enough in terms of talking about it.
I have to say, Arfan, you do sound like a bit of an expert on... and yeah, please do clap. There was never a good time to cut in there. I get the feeling you could talk forever about this. We were going to actually do the poem before that, but what I think now that you've spoken, what we'll do, if you don't mind, because you did mention the police suite, and Chijoka, you obviously are involved in this country. So I wonder if you could say a bit about that. Maybe if you could stand where Arfan was, or whichever you prefer. You can do it with a handheld.
Yes, I think in terms of policing it, it's a privilege to be here and to listen to the story of David Oluwale. I come from Nigeria myself, which is always interesting that when you're in the motherland, you don't always feel black till you cross the ocean. You're in Europe, you're reminded that you're an African who is black by the system. And in some ways, not much has changed. I want to say this cautiously because I know we're trying to inspire hope, but there's a lot that hasn't changed in the policing in Leeds, which in the work I do, I was in Ellen Road for 7 hours yesterday night. A boy who was 15 was picked up at 8:30 a.m. and taken to Ellen Road, accused of a robbery. And we arrive at the station, the paperwork, they say, well, there were 3 witnesses, and they say that they saw a black male, 6'11", 6'3", 5'11", and he's 5'7". And they said, well, also we saw someone who had dreadlocks, and he didn't have locks. And I remember the officer saying, well, the reason we have arrested you is because a police officer has identified you in hair heels. And the boy was shocked. And he says, well, I think I might know who the officer is because he follows me home. And he described the officer. And actually, the officer he described, again, we're on radio, so I've got to protect myself. But there's been stories of that officer threatening other people in hair heels. I'm like, I know who you're describing. So I think in some ways, on the ground, there's a lot of that hasn't changed much in certain parts of the inner city. Maybe not in the whole of Leeds. I can speak of the hair heels context, stop and search as well. If you look at a night out in town, anyone who goes out at night, Friday night, people are out tonight. And, but the police don't touch you if you're white and Brigitte. If you look at the stop and search statistics, especially on Brigitte Road, that street has a high disproportionality both by the call lane. But the question of who is being stopped hasn't changed. It's still people who look like David. I guess for me, where the hope comes from is being together and finding a way to see how people can hear those stories and begin to just almost think about who is responsible. And I think we all are responsible, whether you're working in an official capacity. I like to see myself as an organizer. It's just organizers are needed because you need people who can work with people. You don't really need to have power, just need to have more courage. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Yeah. Now, just before Akil comes up, Cherie is going to read a quick poem, and then Akil is going to read too. So, Cherie, please. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Yeah, this is just a short poem that I wrote, being the mother of an 18-year-old young black man. It was something that was obviously close to my heart. It doesn't have a name yet, but yeah, it's a poem about stop and searching. His gaze is the same as that slaver's lurching, unswayed in the stop and searching. Resilience burnt in, brilliant, brave, hard, learnt in, backbone. The windrush scandal storm thins with rust. A choir of an empire of ancestors warns of the vandals of trust. After the colonial hold, this same long song is his strong soul's scaffold. Thank you.
And now, Akil, I think you're going to come up and read us a couple of poems. We're just going to get the microphone ready for you because you're a little bit taller than Cherie and me. So please go and introduce your poems. And
a bit speechless after everyone has spoken. Thank you. It was honestly an honour to be here. And Keith has been reading Oluwale poems for a while. It was only recently that it fully hit me, the kind of enormity of the story and keeping the story alive as well. And my journey with racism has been interesting. I think as a young man, I was almost ignorant myself of race and that I was different. I went to an all-white, really, secondary school. There was about 5 of us Asians. I don't know how many black people there were, but it was probably a similar number, maybe even less, you know. And there was little racist things that happened, but it was just banter, you know. It was banter, you know. You thought you... But as I've got older, you know, you do realize you are different. And I've become more in touch with my family and my own history. And, you know, even like 2 weeks ago, I was racist, you know. There was a little racist attack against me. So it's funny, you know, how people are ignorant. I was unaware of race because I just saw people as people, and I still do. I just try to connect with them and see, you know, past any issues. But anyway, I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote in a Khadija Ibrahim workshop. It was the unveiling of the statue, Hibiscus Rising, and I wrote that poem there, and it came out all at once, and I was kind of suddenly overcome. And the poem is really, I'm not as educated, and it was good learning more of the story today. This poem is just a poem of humanity, really, trying to connect with David and how he must have felt. It's called Oluwale Unbroken. David staggered into a mass grave, bodies stacked slaves, humanity betrayed, humanity flayed, humanity slayed. David staggered into ashes like diamonds, the lifelines of hibiscus rising, but the grief of mud and mither. David staggered into beatings like butcherings, wearing and carrying the spoilt silks of innocence, of ancestors othered. No colour to his future, the colour had withered. David staggered into desperation, into thirst, towards safety, away from home, singing the Lagos of lingers or humming the drumming march of his people. David staggered, David fell, David fallen, David broken, David lost, David homeless. Oluwale, the name is spoken. Oluwale, Oluwale, Oluwale broke, but he is unbroken. David, listen, I dived into the water in my dreams, and I was shivers and you were still shivering. David, listen, David, brother, your name Oluwale haunts my dreams. Oluwale, 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 every night I hear your petrified screams. Yeah, and I must I think learn that poem by heart so I can really connect with the poem more. I just wrote it, so I haven't performed it many times. This is a poem now about Palestine, so I'm not really a big activist, to be fair, I don't know. But I was at the Palestine March, the one in London the other day, and as we were walking down, you know, it was a massive crowd, and I was a little bit uncomfortable, really, and there was chants going along and everything, and there was a chant, and I looked to my left, you know, I was thinking someone had a megaphone. I was expecting a big person, you know, a leader, walking through the crowd, leading these people, and I looked over, it was a 10-year-old boy doing this chant. He can't have been more than 10, 11. I was almost shocked, you know. And I looked over and I thought, oh, maybe, you know, he's having fun here, you know. This boy was not smiling. You know, he was dead serious. You know, and he was leading these people. He's a boy you'd follow into war, and it really moved me. I couldn't shake this image of the boy. I can still see him now, you know, just over here. And this poem is kind of for him and for what is going on right now. And it's called Sisters with Grenades in Their Hands, and it's kind of a song for Palestine. No man is ever safe where he is safest. No butcher can be betrayed. No woman is ever home if she is homesick. No change in the regime. Profiteers of war never arraigned. If money talks, then who is listening? If money talks, then who is listening? If money talks, then who is listening? And what's a man worth with a hammer in his hand? The coward falls to his knees to repent. And what's a man worth with a flower in his palm? Tell me which way to the Guiltworks Brewery. Tell me which way to the Guiltworks Brewery. Tell me which way to the Guiltworks Brewery. And there are no saints in a murder of crows. Bury the seeds where flowers don't grow. Sisters with grenades in their hands. The child soldier marches to reclaim his homeland. The child soldier marches to reclaim his homeland. The child soldier marches to reclaim his homeland. The child soldier marches. The child soldier marches. The child soldier marches. Thank you.
Wonderful, Akil. That was really, really powerful. And Cherie, now I think we're going to have a brief conversation. And I think at some point, Chijoke, you also do poems. So maybe you'll read one for us, maybe when we've had a bit more discussion. But I'll start with you, Arfan, and I'll bring the microphone over to you. Or if you prefer to go up there, you can, but it's up to you. I told you I did a little bit of homework before this, and I watched the event with Lord Adibowale, and you were on the panel for that. So I know that was about, could there be another Oluwale? And I think everyone was agreed that day that actually it's a pretty daft question. At the very least, it's a rhetorical one, because obviously not only can there be, but there still is, isn't there?
Unfortunately, yes, that's the hard reality. We live not only in a racist country, but as Akila just highlighted, there's a global element in this. And unfortunately, since the killing of David Oluwale 55 years ago, many people of colour have died, whether it's in custody, whether it's in hospitals, whether it's even at birth. So there's something systemic within this society which brings out a disproportionate impact on black communities.
Well, there are lots of things we and not just people dying, but also the way they're treated when they're not dying. Cherie, I wonder if you'd like to come in, but also maybe tell us something about your experience of your first child and those things from hospital. I don't know if you want to tell us about those. Or you want to ask our friends?
Oh, you mean
yes,
what the doctor said?
Yes.
I mean, I suppose this is to do with health. It was just something we were speaking about when we were talking about this event, and it was just when I was pregnant with my first child in hospital, and I had I was being checked over in an early pregnancy, and I was asked, how many pregnancies have you had? And I said, it's my first pregnancy. And the doctor laughed and said, tell me the truth. How many pregnancies have you had? So as a young black woman, there was this assumption that, that somehow, my colour meant that, I had certain morals and certain labels attached to me. And so I suppose across whether it's, whether it's health, mental health, those kind of things. in your socioeconomic situation, you know, when you are othered like that, obviously affect mental health. And similarly, afterwards, I wasn't listened to when I was in pain and ended up going back in with sepsis. So these are often, you know, these are the kind of different areas, but it's kind of, it all ties into that same systemic idea. But I also know that, Chijoke, we spoke earlier, and you were speaking about, you know, an event I might attend regarding your work, and I wondered, you know, looking at, you know, obviously things have a long way to go, but what kind of things are you hoping to improve?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be fair to the system, we have to give thanks. I want to give thanks for the race action plan that was launched for policing. It's the chief constable was in Chapel Town some days ago to say sorry. And previously he was in Print Works to say sorry. And that's how he began by saying, we are sorry. And I think one has to recognize that as a sign. It's not my place to judge the motive, but so I think there's a sense in which West Yorkshire Police, as well as every police force in England, have to deliver the race action plan. And the fact that they have a plan, it's a good thing. And they're about to launch a new complaint procedure in Hare Hills on the 12th of December. And the idea is that people can complain easily. I love the blues. I love the blues because the blues is song, but the blues is complaint. And there's no form. You sing the blues. You don't write the blues. You sing the blues. So I think to have a complaint system is a good step. So I'm saying that to say that's what might be good is for those people who are trying to complain, to see a police force that can respond with humility. I had a case where I put in a complaint some months ago. A guy who was stopped and searched by close to St. James. When this stop started, the officer says, I bet he's delivering. On his body worn video, I bet he's delivering, which means he's probably dealing drugs. And in the complaint, that was covered up. And they said, well, what he meant was he was new in the area. But actually, just to say this here, they've changed the law. The law has changed. There's a law that makes it difficult to review the outcome of police complaints. Now, this is what most people don't know about, but actually, if you complain against the police, in order for that to be dealt with properly, you have to write a right of review, before, which would mean they would look at it a second time, but it's not been taken away. But working with the police and society organizers to have a better complaint process, hopefully, will be a good sign.
Oh, sure, yeah. I guess I can throw this question open to both of you, and if you need a microphone, which you will if you're answering, then obviously tell me. But in terms of people who look like me do not always have the right attitude to this. They don't live the experience. They don't have to go through every day dealing with everyday aggressions or what people call microaggressions, the little bits of hostility, the big bits. How do we educate more of those people into how to be receptive to these ideas? That often they just reject them out of hand without understanding them. What do you think the first thing that we need to do with that is in terms of educating people generally who are not suffering these problems every day?
Well, there are allies and have always been allies in terms of race equality over the years, and that's really important to highlight. If you use the Anti-Nazi League in the 70s, it was mainly white people who really pushed it with support of black and Asian people. So there's always allies out there. And I think for me, it's a class issue. So it comes down to class. There are commonalities between white working class and those black and African and Asian communities who come predominantly from working class backgrounds. And I am a firm believer, it's a bit old school, but of class identity. And we need to draw some of those class identities, those commonalities together. The political establishment want to erase the concept of class. Social class still exists. It might be a bit more subtle. And a lot of the anti-fascist and anti-Nazi campaigns were about people from working class backgrounds coming together. And if you look at the Oluwale murders, it was Leeds United football fans, which I understand were also supportive because they're working class. David Oluwale was also working class. And working class people have suffered. And the issue of race has been used by the establishment globally to divide that class consciousness. So I'm a bit old school when it comes from a class perspective, but that's how I would approach it.
That's a great answer. I think for me, because of race is a social construct. We're human beings. We are people. I think there's a deep need to ask why people cry as much. Because for me, I think there's power in weeping. Before getting involved, you have to be moved. I mean, we're in East Leeds. The Hales isn't too far from here. Seacroft isn't too far from here. We know the knife crime is going on. We know what is happening in this place. So I think there has to be a way. I mean, before I used to think about education and decolonize this and decolonize, I'm thinking, no, just learn how to cry. Because when you're able to feel, you can now begin to act. Secondly, I would say there's also a need for people to be willing, white people have to be willing to say, yes, we can give up privilege. Yes, we can. So example, you can decide tonight, the people in this room, to go on a patrol at Brigade at 12 a.m. and see who is being stopped. On a Saturday night, on a Friday night, you would see what is happening before your eyes. So I think that sense in which, if this is going to change, there has to be a willingness to say, you know what, maybe I have enough privilege, but I'm willing to say that I would go to prison and just ask how many people are in custody tonight at Ellen Road. And they might send you away. They'll tell you, who are you? Come back again. How many people are in custody tonight? They'll send you away. They will begin to see the care.
Yeah. And there's a big thing about history, because you mentioned the transatlantic slave trade. History was my subject, so any chance to speak about it, I like to take it. But a lot of people, there seems to be quite a trend in public discourse, especially across social media now, to downplay the slave trade because there were other slave trades and because there were other people enslaved other than Africans. And what they're failing, this is my view, so anyone who wants to weigh in, what they're failing to do is to look at the legacy. Instead of they shouldn't be looking at other slave trades. They should be looking at the legacy of this one. For example, the Barbary slave trade. People talk about that because Cornish people and Irish people, our people, were sometimes enslaved in much smaller numbers, taken away to North Africa. That really happened, but until you are being dragged out of a car and held at gunpoint by the police or getting kicked in the balls or whatever, and you haven't done anything wrong, and it's because you're Cornish, then we can talk about that slave trade too. And that, I think, is the big thing that I always look at. And when we educate people, the history is so important. Shall I go to...
I think that also relates to, Arfan was speaking about when it comes to working classes and the idea of divide and rule, and the idea, the divide and rule, is echoed from colonialism. And I think that, as you spoke about as well, Chidoke, about the labels, all of these things, and these constructs beneath it were people feeling. And we know that really. But I think until, there isn't going to be a comprehensive, a program in education to really unpick the workings that are at the very roots of the construct of race. And I think, but I think it's very empowering to think, as you said, Chijoke, as individuals, I think we do know better. And I think people are beginning, without that clarity, to still understand that, that there are tricks within the system, that they don't want that fully acknowledged because those tricks are still in use.
Just before we finish up this part, Arthur mentioned about pages and pages of things about the transatlantic slave trade, educating children stuck in cupboards. But behind him, Joe is, I've been reminded, is an authority on this history. So I wonder if you would come out and maybe say something, Joe. You can stay where you are and I'll bring this, or you can come out, whichever you're most comfortable with. Into the light. Come right into the light here and
come into the light. Thank you very much. Yes, as you mentioned, transatlantic slavery, I think one of the issues is that people in Leeds are not quite aware of how that connects with Leeds and their lives directly. And another argument, you say, the Barbary slave trade, and the other one is, well, we ended slavery, didn't we? Yeah. And so therefore Yorkshire is known for William Wilberforce, and there are Wilberforce villages in the West Indies and in Africa, so he's very well respected. But to use him as an argument, as a way of denying that it has any connection with Yorkshire is misleading. And as part of the David Oluwale's Leeds walk, is that I look into where is the humanity in the narrative of telling David Oluwale's story, specifically because people from the West Indies are kind of sick and tired of the degradation and the dehumanization as representation, because it should be a people's humanity that they're represented by. And when we look at Leeds' history, Leeds connects with sugar. We've got Harewood House. Sugar was used in brewing in the beer business. Cotton, slave-grown cotton, is actually the foundation of the Industrial Revolution, creating employment for many thousands of people here in Yorkshire in the textile industry. Because of the cheapness of cotton, they developed technology to manufacture more of it. That technology then was adapted to wool. And that's what then boosted Yorkshire's economy, as well as flax. And you've also got tobacco. If you look in the 19th century trade directory, there are so many tobacconists, and that tobacco came from slave plantations in Virginia. So the contextualization I try to give is that David Oluwale's dehumanized treatment comes from a long history that impacted on people who are here in Leeds today, and by ignoring that narrative, it almost enhances the dehumanization. So we've got to try to rehumanize the narrative of David, see David's heritage, the rich culture of Benin that was destroyed in 1896 by the British. You've got King Jaja of Opobo from Nigeria, who was a palm oil manufacturer, and that palm oil went into soap like Watson's soap, or here in Leeds it was called Soapy Joe's, which was one of the biggest soap manufacturers in the country, that was then sold out to the Lever brothers. And they had their plantations in the Congo, in the Belgian Congo, which was like extreme brutality. Societies were undermined and fragmented, and it meant that people had to migrate. So when you understand this slavery, colonial history, you understand the disposition that Africans are in, and that really all that discomfort was created to elevate the economy in Britain. And so really, we're a team, really, in terms of going forward.
Keep the microphone there. I'm going to ask Arthur as well, and I'm going to ask you both the same question. How do we get the wisdom that you're talking about, just the history, the facts, the stories, how do we get that into schools?
Well, Arthur quite rightly mentioned we worked together between 2005 and 2009 to create the Leeds Bicentenary Transformation Project, which was started by Arthur. I looked at the arts and heritage side, and we put together, and education, we put together a teacher's pack which then should have been, well, as Arthur says, it was distributed to schools, but there was to be a second phase to have facilitators to link teachers with the complex issues in the pack. And it's something that is designed to bring us together rather than drive us apart. But then the funding was dropped, and the teachers were not empowered to engage with the pack, and so the packs are still gathering dust today.
For me, as I say, I'm an optimist, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. If you look, someone picked up on class. You can't want a bigger class, and the Prime Minister of Jamaica visited England in the 60s, and he was pushed off a pavement sidewalk in London by a little policeman. This is the Prime Minister of Barbados, of Jamaica. A barrister from the Caribbean who named should be in the Guinness Book of Record, Rudy Narayan. They put the case, but they never put his name in there. So what's this? And for me, the worst institution in England is the education department.
Well, it just so happens that at home, I have someone to refer to about educational matters because she's in the field of inclusive practices in education, and they go through data, the sort of data you're talking about. And so if you don't mind, she's actually in the room. So I'm just going to, can I take this over to you, or do you want to come out? I'll fetch it over to you. And then because we've got to end quite soon, so. Do you want to take this, or do you want to take this? Yeah.
Thank you. Often I was really interested in what you were saying about the playing people off against each other and the divide and conquer. I read a really important paper by an academic called David Gilbourne, who was looking at the fact that when data is used to compare groups against each other in schools and the performance, it's used to say that white children who receive free school meals are not as performing as well as children from minoritized ethnicities who are also on free school meals. There's never any comparison as to how they're doing against the middle class kids. And all that data is used to say, oh, there's going to be race wars because look at how these different groups are performing. No one's ever talking about class wars. And it's that typical sort of divide and conquer. And I think the use of data in education is really important to start to shine a light on an issue, but it can also be used, exactly as everybody on this panel has been talking about, to dehumanize people, to treat them just as a number, and also to other them, to say, oh, they're like this, this group of people need this thing, and not look at actually the person behind that. And I was quite struck earlier when we were talking about David, and it was talked about as a story. It wasn't a story, it was a life. It was a life that was taken. We need to remember that there are people behind the statistics, behind the data. Those are human beings.
Thank you. We are probably, how we do, we're nearly getting to the end. I think that we must not end without you doing a poem. But before you do your poem, Joe is going to say something here. Here we go.
Very quickly. Thank you. It ties in with something Max was saying earlier about the humanity and the humanity of Leeds. And there was a great outpouring of the weekend of the launch, and it was beautiful to see the people of Leeds coming together. And I think you were talking about the social justice legacy. And I just feel I have to mention a Leeds man called Thomas Harvey, who in 1838 heard about atrocities taking place in the West Indies after slavery was abolished. And he was a chemist, and in those days they didn't have sweet shops, so the chemist is where you went to get your candy or your sweets. And it must have played on his conscience. And being a Quaker, he acted on his conscience. He traveled with a gentleman called Thomas Harvey from Birmingham to the West Indies to witness the atrocities for themselves. They brought back an 18-year-old West Indian called James Williams, who testified to Parliament about the atrocities that took place after slavery was abolished, when the slave laws were distinguished. The plantation owners could then be extremely brutal, and they were. When Parliament heard about the atrocities, they abolished the apprenticeship system there and then. And so that's why we say 1838 for the date for the end of slavery. So it was somebody from Leeds who took action, and he's mentioned in that book. And it's just wonderful. More people need to know about him. In terms of statues, we should have a statue to Thomas Harvey.
Yeah. That would be more relevant than the statues we have today.
There is so much still to know. Thank you so much for that, Joe. I didn't know that, and I'm from Leeds. And Kijoke is going to round us up with some of his poetry.
So this is called Ihonanya, and it's the word that says love in Igbo. So Igbo is my mother tongue.
Ask our panel or anyone here anything else. Final thoughts before Max takes us home. Okay.
Yeah. No, well, first, just thank you for everybody for being part of this. And again, I just want to emphasize that, those of you here in the room, those of you listening from far away, this is the kind of program we can come back to, we can share and continue to share. So we'll make sure that there's a lot of stories that were shared today that I think are important to continue to spread around. So I guess just maybe a quick closing thought, if there's just, and anybody who wants to from the panel, just maybe just a couple of words, a sentence or so of just something that.
I've got one sentence to say, which is, next time we'll have more young people in the
Yes. Well, we're talking about some projects to get young people from this community and other parts of Leeds together on the radio, talking about David Oluwale's story and others, and the impacts for now, but for the future. So, no, I think just sorry, what's that?
Yeah, no, saying this.
Oh, okay. So just a quick, last chance to send a message out to radio listeners and everyone else out here who are part of the show, if anybody wants to just say a final word. So, yes.
A word that's not been used today, may have been used earlier. all the symptoms of what we've got today is due to one word, and the word is capitalism. That is often the origins of the difficulties we have in society. It is capitalism which is the key driver to racism and other isms and underrepresentation.
And a thank you, by the way, to Joe and Arthur. So thank you for joining us. So other final thoughts. Shari, Chijuke, anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think just want to thank the listeners for the time. Thanks, the organizers. What I would say is we need to also think more around how can we do the love question better across different boundaries, because some of these issues are also about relationships, about how we treat one another. So I just want to encourage that there's a need to think of what is the role of love in social change.
Thank you, Chijuke. And I think I just really, I loved the togetherness and unity that your poem spoke of. And in that vein, one of the beautiful things about people coming together and speaking about David Oluwale's life is, it's through an event, created by DOMA that I met Keith and we discussed our issues, and then he put this forward today to another event regarding DOMA. And so, there is change. These are small changes that we should still celebrate, just as the massive achievement of the sculpture Hibiscus Rising. So there's still much to celebrate. And as Chijuke said, it's still, together we can all still have love.
Thank you, Chevy. And finally, to close it out, I'm going to pass it back over to Max just to talk about a few announcements, looking forward to the future before we end the broadcast and end this day of the Writing on Air Festival. Max.
So firstly, I want to thank this fabulous community radio station, Arts Centre, the thriving hub of the community of Seacroft, Chapel FM. Can I have a big round of applause? The workers don't need to applaud unless they want to applaud themselves, but let's have a big round of applause for Chapel FM itself.
Whoa, whoa.
I'm absolutely astonished that they can put on so many complex events over such a short space of time. I don't know how they're all still standing. But having said thank you to them, I also want to thank my own colleagues and friends who are on the board of the David Oluwale Memorial Association, because there's 11 of us, everybody pulls their weight, and we're not always together at the same time, but they do a fantastic job as a collective trying to bring this message to Leeds. And our next event is actually next Friday when we're launching a new book, which is a follow-up to the book that Cherie's lovely poem is included in, the David Oluwale Remembering Oluwale Anthology. The second book is called Oluwale Now. That includes a lot more poems, a lot more prose, and this time it includes a lot of artwork. So we want to conclude really with another big piece of praise to Yinka Shonibari, because he has used these words which have just been picked up so nicely in this last session. He says that the statue, the sculpture that he's made stand for empathy, love, beauty, and passion. And those are the human attributes that draw us all together, that are our future as a common people, fighting the forces of injustice, proclaiming the rights of all human beings, and obviously, to pick up another point in the last few minutes, working class people who, whatever their color, tend to get the sticky end of the stick. And nevertheless, they will in their better moments proclaim their common humanity with the others as well. So on that note, thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you, the listening audience, and much praise to Chapel FM.
And this has been Hibiscus Rising. Sorry to throw you off there. Hibiscus Rising is part of the Writing on Air Festival. East Leeds Community Radio will be back on the radio again tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning with a full day of Writing on Air. And thanks again also to the tech group in the back there. So big round of applause.